Please let me go, she'd begged, but no one in Dry Hollow cared. Tied to that post, sun blistering her skin, they saw only a harlot, bruises blooming like dark flowers, proof to them of her sin. But they didn't see it, didn't see the terror shimmering in her eyes or know the truth of that back alley. Didn't matter. Fact is, a cowboy saw something different, walked right through that rabid crowd, untied her. Be my wife instead. The fools. They think they punished her. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Tied to that post, sun blistering her skin, they saw only a harlot, bruises blooming like dark flowers, proof to them of her sin. But they didn't see it, didn't see the terror shimmering in her eyes or know the truth of that back alley. Didn't matter. Fact is, a cowboy saw something different. Walked right through that rabid crowd, untied her. Be my wife instead. The fools, they think they punished her. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The year was 1883, and the air in Dry Hollow, New Mexico territory simmered with a heat that did more than just bake the earth. It nurtured prejudice, suspicion, and a brand of self-righteousness that clung to the townsfolk like dust devils. A cloud of that very dust swirled around the gathered crowd in the town square. Their faces, usually tanned by the sun, were flushed with a different kind of heat, the ugly blush of judgment. At the epicenter of their collective ire, bound tightly to a weathered wooden post, stood Nora May, 22 years old and the living canvas of a brutal shame. Her once pale blue dress, now ripped and stained, clung to her like a shroud. Matted strands of dark hair, stiff with dried blood and sweat, plastered against her swollen cheek. Her split lip throbbed, one eye squeezed shut against the glare, and her bare feet were cut to ribbons by the unforgiving gravel. Children, wide-eyed and innocent of true depravity, pointed and giggled. Women, their faces pinched with disapproval, clucked their tongues and shook their heads as if witnessing an unfortunate stain on a pristine tablecloth. Men, the architects of this spectacle, leaned against the dusty storefronts, arms crossed, chewing tobacco with a detached air, as if they were observing a particularly dull livestock auction. A voice, sharp and mean as a shattered bottle, sliced through the oppressive air. That's what you get for tempting married men, you little harlot. The words were followed by a wet splat as a rotten tomato detonated against Nora's side. She flinched, a strangled gasp escaping her bruised throat. Another voice, thick with smug satisfaction, cackled. Mayor's son said she cornered him behind the chapel, said she begged for it. The chorus of jeers amplified, punctuated by the thud of overripe onions, squashed fruit, and a discarded boot heel striking her battered form. Nora, summoning every ounce of strength she possessed, lifted her face. Her voice, raw and broken, cracked as she pleaded, "Please let me go." But the words died in the suffocating atmosphere of condemnation. No one moved, no one cared. Not a single soul dared to question the narrative of her guilt. Not one considered that the bruises might be testament to a different story entirely. She slumped against the rough wood of the post, her body trembling with exhaustion and humiliation. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of shame that drowned out the taunts. Her vision blurred. The faces in the crowd swam together in a hateful, indistinct mass. Her knees buckled, but the unforgiving ropes held her upright, a grotesque puppet displayed for the town's twisted amusement. Then a sound cut through the cacophony, the measured, deliberate thud of bootsteps, heavy, calm, purposeful. The crowd hushed, a ripple of unease spreading through their ranks. A tall, broad-shouldered figure materialized from the periphery, dust motes dancing around the brim of his dark hat. He wore no badge, offered no greeting. Yet as he moved through the crowd, they parted before him as if compelled by an unseen force. His presence wasn't loud or ostentatious. It was etched from silence and tempered steel. He stopped 5 feet from the post, his gaze rising to meet hers. Nora opened her swollen eyes and her gaze locked with his. His eyes were the color of a storm-swept sky, but they held no judgment, only an unnerving stillness and a flicker of something that resembled recognition. He turned to the sheriff, who stood off to the side, arms folded, his face smug with authority. The man's voice, even in low, carried with a surprising force. "Untie her!" The sheriff blinked, his self-satisfied expression faltering. "Excuse me?" The man took a step closer. "You heard me. Cut her loose." The sheriff sputtered, his face reddening. "Now hold on. She's been sentenced by the town council." The man didn't argue. He simply reached for the knife at his hip, his movements slow, deliberate, devoid of theatrics, but imbued with a certainty that sent a shiver of apprehension through the crowd. He walked directly to the post, the blade flashing in the sunlight, and severed the ropes with a single clean stroke. Nora stumbled forward, her legs giving way. The man caught her, one arm wrapping firmly around her waist, supporting her weight. He turned to face the stunned crowd, his gaze sweeping across their faces. A murmur rippled through the square. Someone whispered, "That's Charles Boone." Another voice, hushed and fearful, hissed, "He left town after that shootout years ago. Never thought he'd show his face again." Charles looked down at Nora, her face buried against his chest, then back up at the crowd. His voice, now amplified not by volume, but by unwavering conviction, resonated in the sudden silence. "If you're going to punish her for being alone in this world, then let me stand beside her." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence was so thick it seemed to suffocate the wind. Then, clear and resolute, he spoke the words that would forever alter the course of Nora's life. "Be my wife instead." Gasps echoed through the square. Someone dropped a basket of produce, the contents scattering across the dusty ground. The crowd, once a roaring sea of self-righteous fury, stood frozen, paralyzed by disbelief. Nora, barely conscious, pressed her forehead against his chest and wept, not from fear, but from a dawning realization that someone, for the first time in her life, had chosen to claim her, not out of pity, but out of something akin to defiance. The wagon rolled slow through the tall grass, the sound of the wooden wheels softened by earth and wind. The town of Dry Hollow faded behind them like a bad dream swallowed by distance. Before them stretched the open prairie, endless, golden, and held the door open. Nora stepped inside first, her spine a little straighter, her daisy still in hand. The door shut, and the prairie wind carried the dust of the retreating mob back into the nothingness they came from. The rhythm of the days began to change, not because anything grand happened, but because Nora was beginning to belong. Each morning, Charles saddled his horse and asked, not ordered, if she wanted to ride. At first she said no, then maybe, then yes. He taught her how to sit tall in the saddle, how to guide the rest with patience, not fear, how to trust the animal beneath her. Don't yank, just ask, like you'd ask a person who's got no reason to obey. She laughed once, just once. When her horse sneezed on her skirt, he turned at the sound like he hadn't heard a woman laugh in years. Maybe he hadn't. Afternoons were filled with quiet work. Charles showed her how to tend to the herbs, comfrey chamomile, esconatia, how to water their roots without drowning them, how to crush the leaves into salvies that soothed burns and bruises. They built a chicken coop together, and though Nora's hands blistered from the hammer, she didn't stop. He offered gloves. She refused. At supper, he told her about his father, a man too proud to bend and too bitter to stay. He taught me how to shoot, but not how to sit still. She told him about the hymn she used to hum as a child alone in the church storeroom where they locked her when she cried too loudly. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. And somehow that was more. One night a storm rolled in, black clouds churning like angry oceans above the plains. The rain came fast and hard, pelting the roof with fury. Thunder cracked so loud the walls trembled. Nora stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself. Charles came up behind her and held out something, an old leather coat, frayed at the cuffs, the seams weathered soft from use. "It's too big," he said, voice calm. He gave a small shrug. "Like me, but it keeps you warm." She took it without a word and wrapped it around her like armor. It smelled like smoke and saddle soap and something faintly familiar. She wore it the rest of the night. A few days later, she stitched something in silence by the hearth. Charles didn't ask what it was. He simply kept sharpening a blade, feeding wood to the fire, whittling a bit of cedar like it might become something useful someday. When she was done, she folded the cloth and placed it quietly by his saddle. It was a handkerchief, pale brown linen with a single stitched letter in the corner. E. She never said what it stood for. He never asked. But the next morning, as he saddled up for a ride to check the fence line, he tied the handkerchief to the base of the saddle horn. Not around his neck, not hidden away, right where anyone could see. Nora saw it from the porch, with her arms crossed and wind tugging at her sleeves. She watched him mount the horse. He didn't look at her, didn't explain, but he reached down once briefly and ran his fingers over the embroidered edge like it meant something holy. She didn't speak, but she felt it deep in her ribs, the shift. She was no longer a guest or a pity or a problem he had chosen to carry. She was something he had chosen to keep. The morning the letter came, the wind had gone still. Charles found it nailed to the gatepost, the seal of the dry, hollow courthouse pressed deep into red wax. He broke it open without a word. The message was short, signed by the mayor himself. If you do not remove the woman from your property, legal action will follow. Your land is not to harbor sin. He folded the letter once, then twice, and slid it into his coat pocket. Nora saw his face when he stepped inside. She was grinding herbs at the table, the air filled with the scent of sage and pine resin. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Charles didn't answer right away. He poured himself a glass of water, took a long sip, then said, "The town's decided they want to take what's mine. They think if they scare me enough, I'll hand you over." That evening, the sound of hooves came up the path, slow, deliberate. A man in a dark coat dismounted, carrying a folder wrapped in oilskin. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his tone was all authority. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I've been sent by the court. There's a matter to settle." He turned slightly toward Nora, who stood in the doorway. "Miss May, if you sign this confession, state that your conduct was improper. The court will drop all charges against him. Refuse and the property will be seized for harboring indecency." Nora's fingers tightened around the doorframe. The words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Charles's jaw shifted once, the muscles along his neck tightening. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "You've said your piece. Now I'll ask mine." He looked at Nora, not at the man. "Do you want to stay?" Her eyes widened. The question landed like a stone in her chest. He wasn't deciding for her. He was giving her the choice no one ever had. Her hands trembled as she glanced between them. The court messenger, with his cold eyes and Charles standing calm, unbending, the weight of every consequence already on his shoulders. She began, her throat tight. "If I stay, you could lose everything." Charles didn't blink. Things can be rebuilt. People can't. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. She took a step forward, her voice shaking but sure. "I'd rather be hated with you than pied by them." The man frowned, flipping open the document. "Miss May, think carefully. This will be on record. The mayor intends to." Before he could finish, Nora reached out, snatched the paper from his hand, and looked at the words inked in neat, merciless script. Confession of immoral conduct. Beneath it, a space for her name. The very idea made her stomach twist. She lifted her chin, the trembling in her hands replaced by something sharper, steadier. "You don't scare me anymore," she said. The man blinked, startled. Nora's voice grew stronger, echoing through the small yard. "I've already survived worse. I've already survived you." And with that, she tore the paper in half. The sound split the quiet like a whip crack, the fragments fluttering to the ground like pale leaves. The courtman backed away, muttering something about consequences, about law and order. But Charles only stepped forward, the faintest glint of pride in his eyes. "You can tell them," he said evenly. "This land still answers to me." When the rider finally left, the sky was streaked with the deep red of approaching dusk. Nora stood beside the porch, chest heaving, hair tangled in the wind. Charles watched her a moment, then said softly, "You did good." She shook her head. "I just got tired of being afraid." He nodded once. "That's where courage starts." The two of them stood there until the light faded, the scraps of torn paper scattered around their boots, a silent testament to the moment fear lost its grip on her for good. The sun was lowering into the hills like it had nowhere else to be. The sky above Dry Hollow was soft with color. Amber melting into rose, then into lavender, casting a quiet hush over the land. The only sound was the slow tread of hooves on sun-dried dirt, two silhouettes riding up the ridge that overlooked the prairie. Nora sat tall in her saddle, the wind pulling gently at her braid, her hands calm on the reins. Beside her rode Charles, silent as ever, yet never far. The space between them felt fuller these days, not crowded, not heavy, just present. At the crest of the hill they stopped. Below them stretched miles of wild earth, unbroken except for one thin creek, glinting like silver in the dying light. Nora drew a long breath and said, "When I was a girl, I used to dream of a place like this." Charles glanced at her, but didn't interrupt. She continued, voice steady but soft. There was a field with tall grass and a roof that didn't leak, a warm stove, a name on a gate that didn't come with shame, someone waiting at the door who looked at me like I belonged. She paused, then looked down. That dream went quiet for a long time. Charles dismounted first, boots landing in the dry grass with a soft thud. He walked to the edge of the ridge, hands in his pockets, staring out over the valley. Then without a word, he turned back and reached inside his coat. In his hand was something small, rough and dark against his calloused fingers. A ring, not gold, not store-bought. It was made of bent steel, smoothed and coiled, with an inlay of deep-colored wood, mahogany, oiled and shaped by hand. Nora blinked. Charles didn't kneel. He didn't clear his throat. He just stepped forward until they were eye to eye, wind rustling between them like a whisper from the earth itself. "I never asked," he said quietly, "because I didn't want to make you feel owed." Nora's lips parted, but no sound came. He held the ring out. "But I ask now freely. No debts, no past, just choice." His voice dropped even lower. "Will you be my wife?" For a second, the only thing Nora could hear was the thundering in her chest. Then the wind. Then the silence inside her, peaceful and still, like a lake undisturbed. She looked at the ring, then at him, the man who had never asked her to be anything but herself, who had handed her bread without asking for gratitude, who had let her cry without turning away, who had stood beside her when the world turned its back. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and helpless, and full of something she hadn't dared to name until now. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Charles exhaled almost inaudibly and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but honestly. She smiled, really smiled, and the tears slipped down her cheeks, streaking the dust on her skin. Charles brushed a thumb across her cheek but said nothing. They stood together on that ridge as the sun dipped behind the world. The dream she thought she'd buried had found its way back, not in thunder, not in glory, but in stillness, and in a ring shaped by hand, offered by a man who asked and waited. Spring rolled over Dry Hollow like a second chance. The wedding had no chapel, no polished shoes, no hymns from a pulpit, just a field of wild clover swaying under the breeze, a lone birch tree with bark like silver threads, and two people who had nothing to prove to anyone but each other. Nora stood in a simple linen dress, barefoot in the grass. Around her head, a crown of prairie flowers she had woven herself. Daisies, sage blossom, and soft sprigs of yarrow. Charles stood across from her, broad hands clasped in front of him, boots dusty, shirt collar slightly crooked. And yet in the hush between them, there was reverence. They didn't exchange rings again, only words. Charles looked her in the eyes and said, "I won't promise you a perfect life, but I promise you won't face it alone." Nora nodded, tears held back only by the smile that trembled on her lips. They were married beneath the open sky, the wind as witness, and the earth beneath them steady. No lawman, no priest, just love spoken clearly, chosen freely. Later that week, Charles hung a new sign by hand on the wooden arch that marked the start of their land. He carved each letter with care into the oak plank, sanding the edges smooth before raising it into place. Boone Homestead, Charles, Nora, and Hope. Hope, the name of their daughter, born in the quiet of a snow-covered winter. A girl with her father's steady gaze and her mother's fire. Dry Hollow still whispered. Of course, it always would, but the tone had changed. When Nora walked into town now, baby strapped to her chest, people looked, then looked again, softer this time. Some nodded, some lowered their eyes, some even smiled. She was no longer the girl tied to the post. She was a wife, a mother, and now a teacher. Nora opened a schoolhouse in the old canning barn at the edge of the square. Children who once ran barefoot through alleys came each morning smudged with cold dust and dreams. She taught them letters first, then stories, told them they were more than the names they'd been called, more than the shame handed to them. One afternoon she stood in front of her students, chalk in hand, her daughter babbling softly from a woven cradle beside the desk. She traced the word believe on the board and said, "This is what they cannot take from you." When class ended, a quiet girl with ink-stained fingers asked Nora to walk her home. The child had thin shoulders and wide eyes, the kind that flinched when doors creaked too loudly. They walked in silence through the town square, golden light slanting across the bricks. And there it stood, the old post, still bolted to the stone, weathered and worn. Nora paused. The girl tugged her sleeve. "Miss Nora, why do you always stop here?" Nora knelt beside her, brushing dust from the girl's cheek. "This is where they tied me," she said softly. Then she smiled. "But it's also where he untied me and chose me instead." The girl didn't speak, but she reached out and took Nora's hand. Together they turned and walked toward the little barn school, its door propped open, a chalkboard inside, half covered in tomorrow's lesson. Above the doorway, carved into a piece of salvaged wood, hung a sign, Hope's Corner. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire and forgiveness. And in that golden hour, the town of Dry Hollow watched a woman walk through her past, unbroken, unbent, and leave behind something greater than shame. She left behind a legacy. Thank you for writing all the way to the end of Nora and Charles's story. A tale not just of love, but of standing tall when the world tries to keep you down. If this story stirred your heart, made you tear up or cheer just a little, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable romances born from dust, danger, and devotion. See you on the next ride, partner.